Thanks for joining us today, and if you'd like to be the envy of all your friends, you can see this video a week early and get access to all sorts of exclusive Poe Museum content while supporting the Poe Museum. Just sign up at patreon.com/Poe Museum. My friend Edgar seems to be of the opinion that I waited far too long to bring him his dinner this evening, so he was forced to take matters into his own paws. So, while we wait for him to finish his meal, why don't you grab a snack, sit back, and watch the next installment of the Curator's Crypt. Today I'd like to show you one of my favorite artifacts, which is in fact an entire museum in a box. Let's take a closer look. Now here's a story we might all be able to relate to, especially in these times. Imagine you're isolated in the middle of Southwest Virginia on your grandfather's old farm. You just have to get away from it all. That's Lucy Dorothea Henry's life back in the 1840s. She hated living way out in the middle of Southwest Virginia at Red Hill, her grandfather Patrick Henry's farm. And her sole escape, her sole window to the outside world was through poetry. She loved reading and was so fascinated with the latest literature coming from the big cities up north that she just had to meet her favorite writers. So she started writing them, occasionally using her grandfather's name to get her some autographs. And she compiled over 250 autographs and letters and manuscripts from the leading writers and intellectuals and performers and politicians of her day, presidents all the way from John Adams up to Pierce, and of course writers including Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, Nathaniel Hawthorne, Charles Dickens, Washington Irving, and of course Edgar Allan Poe. And in June of 1843, she received this letter in response to her request for an autograph. This is Edgar Allan Poe's letter, written right at the time he was about to be catapulted to literary stardom with the publication of his short story, The Gold Bug, which won a huge contest of $100, which is a lot more money back then than it is today. About a year's rent back then. And here he is sending Lucy Henry his autograph and saying it is his pleasure to comply with her most flattering request. And he signs it, your most obedient servant, Edgar A. Poe. And over the years, she collected even more of Poe's pieces. In fact, the manuscript for his essay, Francis Sargent Osgood, as well as a portion of his essay, The Rationale of Verse, which is Poe's history of English verse. And she faithfully glued these into her autograph album. Now, over the years, she made contacts with some of these great writers and editors up north, including John Keese in New York City, who invited her to come up and visit him, where she met some of the great writers and performers of her day. And after that, she met Octave Leighton, who was a New England poet who swept her off her feet. They moved up to Illinois to start their own literary newspaper, which almost immediately failed. So they went to New England, finally back down to some family land in Virginia near Petersburg. But then things went pretty wrong. The Civil War started, and they found their small family farm right between the Confederate and Union lines. They were so close that she was actually growing crops in her small garden and bringing it to the soldiers. Finally, her husband convinced her she needed to leave. She needed to get out of there where it's safe. And among the few possessions she took with her was this autograph album. She knew she couldn't live without it. And of course, she took her daughters too. She liked them too. But the autograph album. Not the husband. He stayed behind. He convinced her that because he was a Yankee, that he could convince the Union not to burn the farm while they were gone. Well, he was half right. They burned everything but the house. So the outbuildings are gone, but at least he saved the house. So after the Civil War, Lucy Layton returned to the family farm, and a few years later her husband died and left her to fend for herself, taking care of her two daughters, Alberta and Fayetta Layton. And over the years, both the daughters grew up, moved away. One became a school principal up in Petersburg. And she befriended the founders of the Poe Museum. And it was Fayetta Layton who in 1928 donated her mother's museum within a museum, this autograph album, to the Poe Museum, because she said this is the one place she could think of where literature was really appreciated. And of course the museum wanted it because of those 3 Edgar Allan Poe pieces inside. And these tiny bits of paper were so important that the museum early on had them removed from the album and laminated. Today we think that's a really bad idea. You don't want to go laminate your valuable manuscripts. But back then there was a paper conservator, William Barrow, who lived not very far from the museum. His studio was within a few blocks walk of the museum at the time. And he was one of the leaders in paper conservation and restoration. He was one of the innovators in trying to de-acidify papers and inks to make them last longer, but also had this great idea that maybe the paper could last longer if he laminated them. So what he did was he would take a document, much like this, and put it between 2 sheets of cellulose acetate. And this would be too shiny, too much like plastic. So he decided he would laminate tissue into the mix and make a tissue acetate paper sandwich, which he rolled through a big heated press, melting the acetate until it seeped into the paper and the tissue and held all together. And this is what it looked like when it was done. This is a piece of the sandwich without the paper inside. You can see it's not very translucent. But unfortunately, Barrow, even during his lifetime, realized that this wasn't the greatest idea. If you have acidic inks in there, corrosive inks and other elements that are going to damage the paper, they aren't going to be able to off-gas. They're trapping these things inside the lamination sandwich. And that's just going to eat away and destroy the paper. Also, some of Barrow's recipes for the lamination were starting to break down over time. They're warping and discoloring. And on top of that, you really couldn't read the documents all that well through the tissue paper. So before his death in 1967, Barrow was laminating, unlaminating, relaminating the same documents over and over again. And unfortunately, these 3 Poe letters were some of his guinea pigs. So something had to be done. And earlier this year, we decided, well, it's about time. The autograph album needs to be conserved. And where should we start? The Poe documents. So we sent them to Richmond Conservators of Works on Paper. Mary Stutt and Wendy Cowan went to work. And how do you get this lamination off the paper? They cut little pieces off of the edges of the laminations. They didn't actually cut the paper, but they cut off little pieces and tested them in different solvents to see which would work best. And they decided to soak them in acetone. So right here you see Wendy soaking it in acetone, and each of the letters had to be soaked once just to get some of the lamination off, and they peeled them apart. Look how they're peeling them like a banana. And then they had to soak them 3 more times each. And between soakings, wipe a little bit more of this acetone and the adhesive off of the paper, and then put it back in another bath until they could finally get it all off. And this is some of the laminate. This is the tissue and laminate that she removed from some of these. And check this out. This is the tray. That's right, all this goop inside of here came off those letters. So much you can just sort of pick it up. So this was soaked into those letters, heated and jammed into those letters, and now it's finally off of there. But the work's not done yet. Then she had to test the ink. Now, they used a lot of iron gall ink, which contains a corrosive iron 2, which can just eat away at the paper. Sometimes you see old letters where the words are just eaten away in the paper, and you can see through the paper. That's this iron gall ink just eating away at it. So they decided, well, let's test it. And they took little testing strips that they used to detect the presence of corrosive iron 2. After that, they put them in another bath to sort of stabilize the acids in the inks and in the paper. And then they set to work mending different holes and tears they found along the way. There were holes in one of the papers from where it was torn from the album. The glue and pieces of the paper stayed in the album, the rest of the letter came out. So they used some Japanese tissue and a dilute wheat gum paste, something that's fully reversible. If somebody 80 years from now decides they want to take it off, they can do that. It's going to be easy to remove. And they use these to repair any of these little holes or rips in the paper. And then they went back through and saw places where paper and glue were still stuck to these documents from after they were ripped out of the album. And they very carefully and selectively moistened those little areas, these accretions, and scraped them off once they got soft enough to remove. So look right here how it's actually revealed an entire word right here. The word Edgar was lost underneath this accretion, and they were able to successfully remove it. But we're not done yet. Then they soaked it in a special solution of gel to size the paper, make it a little bit stronger, and to help stabilize the ink. But they're not done yet. Then they had to rehumidify the paper, moisten up a little bit, so they could flatten all the papers. And you've probably seen when you've got wet paper and you leave it out to dry, it just curls up. And they didn't want it to just curl and buckle, so they flattened out everything. They dried them under weight, so when they came back to the Poe Museum, they'd be clean and fresh and flat. So they're right back here at the Poe Museum, and they look better than ever. As you can see right here, the before and the after pictures, you can actually read them now. You can get a much better view of how much ink was on Poe's pen. Look at the dark spots where there's a lot of ink, and then as he trails off and loses a little bit of ink, it gets lighter, so as to dip his pen back into the inkwell, get some more. You can even see spots where he's writing quickly or where he has to slow down and hesitate. It's almost like peeking over Poe's shoulder while he wrote. You get a real sense of the activity of his composition. So now that you've seen all the work that went into restoring these papers, come down to the Poe Museum and see them in person. As for the rest of Lucy Henry's album, we've only just begun. We had donations in place from the Virginia Association of Museums and private individuals that helped us get the work started. But we've got hundreds more of these to do. This is going to be a long, involved, multi-year process that will involve taking the entire album apart, photographing and documenting everything, individually restoring certain letters, putting it all back together, and making it accessible to you on the internet. So whether you're able to come here in person or you find us online, you will be able to look through this one-of-a-kind museum in a box. So if you're interested in helping restore the rest of Lucy Henry's album, be sure to write us at chris@poemuseum.org or make a donation right now at poemuseum.org/support. And thanks for joining us for this week's Curator's Crypt. Well, thanks for joining us this week. And if there's anything left of me, I'll see you next time in the Curator's Crypt.